Hey everyone, welcome back. In the wake of the tragic shooting at a Nashville school, I wanted to have a quick chat with you all about the seeming Groundhog Day style political experience that we all go through whenever this kind of tragedy occurs. Politicians say, this is terrible, it should never happen again, we need to do something to stop it. And they propose a variety of different policies, from gun control to better mental health access to reinforcing our school security, and then any other particular policies that might relate to the specifics of the particular incident. But given the fact that there is an odd lack of research on this topic, the debate often devolves into, well, your policy doesn't have any evidence to prove that it will work, so we shouldn't do it. Debate eventually collapses, and inevitably all we're left with are thoughts and prayers. So, I want to talk to you very quickly about why the body of research on gun violence in America is so limited, and a small change that we could make in order to take that first step towards finding a long-term solution to this national tragedy. Normally, when Congress wants to evaluate the potential impacts of a piece of legislation, they go to the relevant federal agency and ask for a report. Now, for example, if they wanted to determine the effect a change in tax policy might have on the deficit, they might go to the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office would then go through all of its data, conduct some research, and come back and say, okay, based on all the data we have, this change in the tax policy would have this impact on the deficit, and it might also have these other impacts on the broader economy. And that data they're relying on depicts historic trends, the effects of previous pieces of legislation that were similar, and it really helps them give a more accurate assessment of the future impacts of any potential piece of legislation. Now, when it comes to gun violence in the US, the agency responsible for studying this is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, as they essentially study everything that can cause death or injury to US citizens. However, if you were to go look at their data on gun violence, you would find that there is a substantial gap in that data. And that's because in 1996, an amendment was added to that year's spending bill called the Dickey Amendment, which prevented any federal funding from being used to, quote, advocate or support gun control. And later in that spending bill, all of the funding towards researching gun violence in the US was stripped out and reappropriated for other purposes. So, the CDC now had no money to research gun violence, and it appeared that it was illegal for the CDC to take any of its other money and use it for that purpose. Now, it's not explicitly stated in the language that the CDC was prevented from conducting this research, but combined with the fact that their funding was stripped away, it was understood that if the CDC produced any research that ended up supporting gun control, that they could be penalized for being in violation of the Dickey Amendment. And that's kind of the problem with research, is you don't always know what conclusions you're going to end up reaching. According to the scientific method, you come up with a hypothesis, you gather the data, and then you evaluate that hypothesis in light of the data. So, yeah, your hypothesis could be gun control doesn't work, but if all the facts that you gather say, no, gun control does work, well, the facts are what they are. And if the facts stated that, then the CDC would have produced research and spent federal money in violation of the Dickey Amendment. So they essentially shut down all research into the issue. Thankfully, in 2018, the language of the amendment was clarified to state that the CDC could conduct this kind of research. However, they weren't allocated any funding to look at gun violence in the US until 2020, creating a 17-year gap in the dataset. Now, this data is incredibly important to evaluate historical trends and to assess the impacts of various state-level policies in order to create a better analysis of what impacts federal policies might have on gun violence in the US. And to replace that dataset is not going to be cheap. However, with Republicans consistently attacking the CDC over COVID and their general desire to prevent any funding from going into any aspect of the government that might even remotely result in gun control, the funding is just not there and hasn't been for many years. So that's a huge issue for building a reliable data set to create these accurate assessments of the problems we face when it comes to gun violence. Additionally, the Dickey Amendment is still in effect, so it's uncertain as to how that research could be used even if it is produced in an accurate fashion. No, the CDC can produce it, but can it be publicized? Can the White House give a press conference about it? Can it be used by Congress to advocate for a bill that the CDC says might be effective according to their data? It's uncertain because all of those things could mean that federal funds are being used to support or advocate for gun control, and that would violate the Dickey Amendment. So, where do we go from here? Well, if we want to be serious about finding a durable, long-term solutions to the issues we're facing, I think there's two things we need to do. Number one, we simply need to provide more funding for research. It's very difficult to solve a problem that you don't understand, and when it comes to gun violence in the US, it's complicated, especially when it comes to mass shootings. There are so many different factors that can influence whether a person chooses to commit gun violence, such as ease of access to guns, mental health issues, socioeconomics, political ideology, race, gender, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and dozens of other potential factors. If we don't understand how all of these factors come together, it's almost impossible for us to draft viable policy solutions. If we can't draft viable policy solutions, then we're just going around in circles in endless political debates and not accomplishing anything. The other thing we need to do is we need to repeal the Dickey Amendment. The language is such that it really creates a hindrance for trying to use any of the facts we might generate from this research to advocate for effective policy. Because people have very strong feelings about guns, whether it's pro or against. But, as Republicans like to say, facts don't care about your feelings, and when you're trying to make effective policy, facts are what's important. So we should let the facts speak for themselves, and if they happen to support gun control, so be it. If they don't, so be it. But I think that we should remove this amendment and allow the facts to speak for themselves. Because as we've seen, thoughts and prayers only ensure that we're going to have many more tragedies in the future. Think about it.